The cold air of the lower level pressed against my skin the moment we found ourselves downstairs with the door closed on us. It wasn't slammed, and it wasn't locked with force, but the sound of it settling into its frame felt far heavier than it should have. A thin strip of dim light hovered above us like a fading lifeline. My breath came out shaky, not from the temperature alone, but from the way the moment wrapped itself around my chest as if the house itself was holding its breath. I steadied my husband, Cornelius, guiding him toward the small set of steps. His hand trembled slightly in mine. I whispered his name, but he brought his finger to his lips, urging me to stay quiet. Then he leaned close, so close that I felt the warmth of his breath against my ear. Quiet. They don't know what's behind this wall. His whisper didn't sound frightened. It sounded prepared, as if he had been carrying this sentence in his pocket for years, waiting for the exact moment it needed to be spoken. A soft tremor passed through me. I stared at him, unable to speak, unable to understand. Behind what wall? The dim light above us flickered, brushing across the old stones that held the lower level together. These walls had always felt old, but suddenly they felt alive, like they were hiding something that had been waiting far longer than either of us had realized. Cornelius touched one of the stones, his fingers finding a particular spot with an unsettling familiarity. It was a single brick, slightly looser than the rest, almost unnoticeable unless you already knew exactly where to look. When he pressed his palm against it, the brick shifted just a little, revealing the faint glint of something metallic tucked in the dark space behind it. A small tin box. My heart lurched. A secret he had kept hidden for nearly 4 decades, waiting in silence behind a wall I had walked past thousands of times without knowing. And now that secret was finally waking up. If you've stayed with me all the way to this moment, then please like this video and leave a sweet little comment. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure you do it now. We share amazing stories like this every single day. The house had a way of remembering me long before I could remember every corner of it myself. 40 years of mornings and nights had pressed themselves into the floorboards and the pigeonholed drawers, into the soft dent where my husband used to rest his knee, and into the narrow groove along the kitchen table where our son learned to trace letters with a stub of pencil. I could still trace the memory of the first day Cornelius and I walked across this threshold, the way the sunlight pooled on the foyer tiles, the smell of fresh paint and possibility, the small, foolish hope that a house could be an anchor against time. Over the decades, the house grew into our life the way a tree grows into an arbor, roots deep, trunk steady, branches holding all the seasons. My father-in-law built it with hands that knew patience. He meant it for family dinners and nephews' laughter and the kind of small, ordinary comforts that are easy to take for granted until they are gone. I learned the house the way one learns a language. The shift of the stairs in winter, the hum of the heater on a Georgia night, the way the kitchen window caught late afternoon light and set it into gold dust across my soup pot. Soup, in fact, became a kind of rhythm for me. The simple chicken broth with dumplings, the way my grandmother taught me to skimp a little unsalt and let the steam carry the rest, was never a fancy dish. It was an offering, a way to build a day into something edible and soft for the people I loved. I remember teaching Travante, my small, stubborn boy, to chop carrots into tiny jewels, standing on a step stool and taking ownership of the wooden spoon like it was a scepter. He'd grin with that reckless, trusting happiness of childhood and proclaim himself a chef, and the house would fill with our laughter. Those memories live in the grain of the table still. The faint ring of a mug left too long, crayon marks half hidden under a placemat, the warm indentation of a small hand. In early years, visits from relatives and the neat, polite bustle of holidays made the house feel like a place where lives braided together. Later, when Cornelius's first small health troubles began, our world shrank in ways I had not expected. Family moved in, out of love, they said, out of duty. At first, it felt right to have the second floor full of voices and footsteps, a sense that no one would be alone when nights got cold. But little things changed first, like water finding a new course through sand, a chair moved without a word, a book taken down and not returned, the steady intrusion of new scents and new habits that settled into the rooms as if they had always belonged there. Kessia, Trevante's wife, never called me anything softer than Ms. Idella, a small, polite distance she kept like a dress she had not been taught to wear. She stood in doorways in soft silk robes, offering suggestions about candles, about which modern chairs would open up the space, and her comments would land on me like cool glass. Trevante, once the boy who climbed into my lap to be read to, began to drift the way children drift when they are pulled by other lives. He spoke less of his childhood memories and more of schedules and meetings. His laughter grew rare and clipped. I tried not to let the small slights become a story in my head, but soup simmered on the back burner of every day, as if to remind me of continuity. I would stir and measure and think of the days when a single bowl could mend a bad mood. There were soft red flags, not the crashing kind, but the quiet, accumulating kind. A remark about simplifying things later, an offhand comment about paperwork that made my chest fold in on itself for a moment, the way voices lowered at my approach. None of these moments themselves were violent. They were the quiet erosion of belonging, a slow weathering that makes strong things brittle. Each evening, I would fold the laundry, set a plate, and listen for the old rhythms of the house, the clock in the hall, the creak of the stairs, searching for where the warmth had gone. I never stopped hoping that small acts, a carefully ladled bowl of broth, a folded hand towel, a story from the old albums, would stitch us back together. Instead, what I felt was a growing solitude under the same roof, an ache that tasted like the stale steam rising from a forgotten pot on the stove. The house continued to breathe around me, but I could feel myself becoming a quieter part of its furniture. Present but unseen, caring but overlooked, cataloging memories the way I had once cataloged archives, carefully, reverently, and with the slow anger of someone watching a history be misread. The second floor of the house had once been a sanctuary of soft colors and lived-in comfort, a place where photographs lined the hallway and the scent of old books drifted from room to room. It didn't happen all at once, the way change rarely does. It began with one new suitcase set neatly beside the guest room dresser, then a row of expensive perfumes along the bathroom counter, then a cluster of glass jars filled with skincare products that sparkled under the vanity lights. Little by little, their belongings began to stretch across the rooms as though the house itself was rearranging its sense of ownership. A throw blanket here, a sleek lamp there, a vase that didn't belong to any season I recognized. New things always have a certain assertiveness to them. They shine in ways older objects don't, insisting on being noticed. And soon, that shine spread across surfaces that had once held decades of quiet memories. The first major shift came when Kessia suggested moving my father-in-law's old armchair, the one with the worn arms and the soft indent from centuries of elbows resting there to read the newspaper. She never said it unkindly. She simply announced that it didn't fit the new look, and so it was gently rolled into the corner of a spare room, tucked away like an outdated fashion. In its place came a modern white chair with beautiful metal lines, but no history, no story, nothing that whispered the voices of those who once sat there. I remember standing in the doorway that day, watching the new chair take its place, and feeling the tiniest shift in my own breathing. The kind of shift you feel when you realize a part of the house has gone quiet. Boxes arrived next, labeled, stacked, filled with things I didn't recognize. New cookware, minimalist decor, scented diffusers, floating shelves. Piece by piece, our old home was curated into something sleek and clean, but in the process, it lost its softness. Old photo frames were gathered into a drawer for later sorting. Quilts made by Cornelius's mother were folded and placed into storage bins. The tea set my grandmother passed down was moved to a higher shelf where no one reached anymore. Even the way sunlight fell into the living room felt different. Curtains were changed, rugs replaced, and suddenly the familiar creaks of the house sounded out of place, reminders of years they didn't share with us. Through it all, I tried to tell myself this was normal. People have their own tastes, homes evolve. But what made my heart cling to the silence was how naturally these changes slipped into the spaces where our old traditions used to live. Sunday mornings, once filled with quiet music and pancakes, became busy with phone calls, errands, and the tapping of my son's laptop keys. Family dinners grew shorter, conversations more clipped. The smell of my chicken broth would travel through the house, but its warmth no longer drew anyone to the table with the familiar eagerness I used to. Treasure. Travante changed in ways that were not dramatic, but steady. He still talked to me, but his voice had sharpened at the edges, not with hostility, but with preoccupation. He was thinking of other things, carrying other priorities, drifting toward a version of adulthood that didn't leave much room for the simple rituals we once shared. In quiet moments, he still smiled at me, still hugged me, but those moments were growing thinner, like a fabric worn over time. I could feel myself withdrawing a little each day, not as a statement, but as a reflex. The more the house shifted, the quieter I became inside it. Not because I wanted to disappear, but because speaking up felt like interrupting something that had already been decided. I cooked, I cleaned, I tended to Cornelius, and I watched the rooms change shape around me. Every so often, I'd pause with a dish towel in hand, look around, and feel like a piece of the house that had been misplaced. Something once cherished, now simply... The hardest part wasn't the modern furniture or the new colors. It was watching our familiar world fade, replaced by a life that didn't really include the memories I was still trying to protect. It felt like standing in the middle of a riverbed while the current slowly carried everything else away. And instead of fighting the pull, I simply let myself grow quieter, settling into the soft ache that comes when you realize the home you built with love is slowly becoming someone else's reflection. It happened on a day that should have been ordinary. The kind of day that begins with the hum of a simmering pot and ends with the soft rustle of curtains in the evening breeze. I had been preparing lunch, stirring the familiar broth while Cornelius rested in the study. The house smelled of chicken, thyme, and quiet routine, the sort of comfort that usually steadied me even when the air in the rooms felt different lately. But that afternoon, a certain stillness hung in the space between us, me, my son, and his wife, as if the house itself sensed a shift I hadn't yet named. Travante came into the kitchen with his phone in hand, not looking up at first, scrolling through something with the distracted intensity he often carried these days. Then he set the phone down, clasped his hands, and looked at me with a seriousness that didn't belong to any small daily matter. "Ma," he began, "we need to talk about the house." My heart folded inward, just a little. I kept stirring the pot to steady myself. "What about it?" His tone was practiced, calm, almost businesslike. "It would make things simpler later if you transferred the deed to me now. Just a formality. You and Dad will still live here, of course. It just avoids complications down the road." I had heard fragments of this sentiment before, offhand remarks about systems and future convenience, but never so direct. I placed the spoon gently on a napkin and turned to him. "The house belongs to your father and me," I said quietly. "We'll keep things as they are for now." I watched something flicker across his face. Surprise first, then frustration, the kind that simmers rather than explodes. Kessia appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the tension, her silk robe whispering against the frame. She folded her arms, leaning with the confidence of someone stepping into a debate already tilted in their favor. "It's just practical," she said lightly. "No one wants extra paperwork later." I nodded once, not defensively. "Just firm. Still, the answer is no." The room held its breath. A thin moment stretched between us, long enough for all three of us to understand that something had shifted, not loudly, but unmistakably. Travante finally exhaled, a slow, frustrated sigh that didn't quite mask his disappointment. He said nothing more, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Later, when Cornelius tried to sit up and join us in the hallway, the air seemed to tighten. My son exchanged a brief look with his wife, not hostile, but tense in a way that made me aware of the fragile ground we were standing on. "Mom," he said, with clipped politeness, "let's move Dad to the lower level for a moment. He shouldn't be straining himself." There was no threat in his voice, no raised tone, just a decisive finality. Before I could respond, we were already guiding Cornelius toward the stairs, and I followed because resisting felt like pushing against a current far stronger than I expected. The moment we stepped onto the first few steps, the air seemed cooler, thinner. And then, with a soft thud, the door above us closed. Not slammed, not locked, just shut, firmly enough that when I reached back up, the knob didn't turn from our side. We suddenly found ourselves downstairs with the door shut above us. The familiar path back to the main floor had quietly slipped out of reach. "We no longer have access to the main floor," I murmured, more to myself than to Cornelius, my voice trembling with disbelief rather than fear. The silence that followed pressed in like cold fog. It wasn't the darkness that unsettled me. It was the realization of how suddenly everything had tipped. We were temporarily restricted to the lower level, separated from the world we had lived in for decades by a single closed door. My breath trembled. Anger didn't rise in me, not yet, just shock, a stunned, hollow disbelief that this moment was real. And then Cornelius, my quiet, fading husband, leaned toward me. His voice was barely a whisper, soft and urgent. "Quiet. They don't know what's behind this wall." I turned toward him, feeling the cold air wrap around my spine, and understood, in a way I couldn't yet explain, that nothing about this day would ever be ordinary again. The dim glow from the thin line of light above us trembled just enough for me to make out Cornelius's expression. His eyes, usually soft and unfocused these days, held a clarity that startled me. He guided my hand gently toward the far corner of the lower level, toward a wall I had walked past hundreds of times without ever wondering if it held anything more than old stone and dust. His fingers brushed a specific brick, one that looked the same as the rest, but shifted slightly beneath his touch, as if it recognized him. I leaned closer, hesitating only for a breath, before pressing my palm against the spot he indicated. The brick gave way, tilting inward just enough for a tiny sliver of shadow to open behind it. Inside the hollow was the faint metallic outline of a small tin box, the kind people used decades ago to store keepsakes, stamps, or tiny letters. It felt cold and impossibly light in my hands. "It's been here almost 40 years, Cornelius whispered, steadying himself against the wall. "My father showed it to me when I was young. He said it held answers and cautions." My breath tightened in my throat. I moved us back toward the short staircase where a faint ribbon of light gave enough visibility to open the tiny latch. It clicked softly, as if releasing a secret that had been waiting its turn for decades. Inside were a few carefully folded pages, yellowed at the edges with the unmistakable scent of older paper. That scent I knew from my days working among archival records. I recognized the texture immediately. They were heritage notes, not legal files, not institutional documents, but deeply personal pieces of a family's private history. The first page was a birth record, simple, handwritten, and old enough that the ink had softened over time. It listed a name I didn't recognize at first, Cassius. Place of birth, a remote care facility in Mississippi, the type of place used long ago for complicated pregnancies or rural medical assistance, far from any large town. Mother listed as unknown, no father's name provided. For a long moment, I didn't understand. "Who is this?" I whispered. Cornelius exhaled slowly, almost painfully. "Me," he said. "That was the name they gave me at birth." The floor shifted beneath me, though I knew it hadn't moved at all. My husband, the man I had built a life with, the man I had trusted more deeply than anyone, had carried another name, another beginning, quietly inside him for all these years. I lifted the next page. It was an adoption certificate, older than any document I had seen from our family's collection. The language was gentle, the way documents once were when written by hand. It stated that my father-in-law, Langston, had legally taken in a child who had been left without proper family care. It said the adoption was done out of compassion and responsibility, a way to protect a baby who had been caught in a complicated situation that would have overshadowed his future. No accusations, no blame. Just a delicate explanation that a misunderstanding surrounding the circumstances of the mother's disappearance had made it necessary for the child to be placed in safer hands. Finally, there was a letter, folded with an almost reverent precision, written in Langston's familiar handwriting. I recognized the looping L of his signature before I even read a single sentence. "My dear son," the letter began, "I want you to grow into the kind of man who knows his worth not because of where he began, but because of what he chooses to become. There were complicated circumstances around your birth, misunderstandings that could have followed you unfairly. I brought you into my home to ensure you would grow in light, not in the shadow of things that never defined you." My vision blurred. I had loved Langston deeply, but I had never known this weight he carried, this quiet protection of a child who wasn't his by blood, but was his completely by heart. Cornelius touched my arm. He tried to tell me when I was older, he murmured, but I never had the courage to face it fully. I didn't want to feel different. I folded the papers carefully, my heart pounding with a mix of shock and reverence. This wasn't a scandal or a crime or anything dark. It was simply a deeply human story, one that held trauma, love, confusion, and sacrifice all tangled together. But it was also powerful, not because it accused anyone, but because it revealed the truth of a name. And I realized, with a cold certainty settling in my chest, that the world my son believed he controlled, the world built on a surname, rested on a foundation he knew nothing about. And that foundation had just shifted beneath us all. The papers lay in my lap like a living pulse, soft with age, yet sharp enough to cut straight through everything I had believed about our family. I sat there on the lower-level steps, holding the truth of my husband's earliest moments, and something inside me shifted with a quiet, irreversible click. Not anger, not outrage, something colder, clearer, a precision I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even defense. It was the sudden, crystalline understanding that the world around me had rearranged itself, and I had to choose whether to be crushed beneath it or to stand up and meet it head-on. I breathed slowly, letting the cool, stale air settle into my lungs. Cornelius rested against the wall beside me, exhausted from the rush of emotion, yet strangely peaceful, as though releasing these hidden truths after 40 years had lightened him. I pressed his hand gently and whispered that everything was going to be fine, not because I believed it yet, but because I knew I would make it so. When the door above us finally opened and the light poured down like nothing unusual had happened, I didn't argue or ask questions. Something in me had frozen into stillness, not numbness, intention. A kind of mental quiet where every detail stood out more sharply. The way their footsteps sounded overly casual, the way Kessia's tone carried just a little too much relief, the way my son avoided meeting my eyes, as if uncertain whether to feel guilty or justified. I watched everything. Not out of fear, out of calculation. They believed the moment downstairs was just a misunderstanding, a temporary inconvenience. They moved around the house with the same careless ownership as before, discussing paint colors and schedules and furniture deliveries as though the home had already changed hands. They stopped moderating their conversations around me. That was their mistake. Because in their carelessness, they revealed everything they valued, everything they feared. Everything they assumed I would never question. I made dinner that night without tasting a single thing. My mind was already moving quietly through possibilities, not in a procedural way. I wasn't thinking about laws or consequences or steps, but in an emotional clarity I hadn't experienced since my archive days. Back then, I used to sort through history with a delicate touch, searching for what truly mattered in a sea of forgotten details. Now I was doing the same thing, only this time the story was my own. When night came and the house grew still, I walked into the old study, closed the door gently, and sat beside the landline phone. A number floated up from some distant memory, a name I had stored years ago after reading about a woman described as brilliant, steady under pressure, and unafraid of complicated family matters. I hadn't known then why the name lodged itself into my mind. Now I did. My fingers dialed before my thoughts could question me. When the crisp voice answered, it held exactly the kind of strength I needed to borrow for a moment. I didn't give details. I didn't mention paperwork or documents or strategies. I simply said I needed help, that it was urgent, that it was personal. That was enough. She listened the way only a disciplined mind listens. No interruptions, no judgments, just attention. When she said she could meet me soon, her tone told me she understood far more than I had spoken aloud. I hung up and rested my hand over the tin box again. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming the ground beneath my feet, the ground I had tended, swept, cooked on, cried on, raised a child on. I heard footsteps in the hallway and stepped out just in time to see Kessia move a stack of old photo albums to the top of a shelf, out of sight. Not cruelly, not even intentionally, simply because they were in the way. That was the moment I understood the full weight of the leverage in my hands. Not legal leverage, emotional leverage. The kind that grows quietly from truth. The kind that doesn't need to shout. The kind that simply waits to be used. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't powerless at all. My silence had always been seen as weakness. They had no idea it was the first step in my strategy, a strategy that was already unfolding, breath by breath, thought by thought, in the calm space where fear had once lived. A cold plan had formed, not to destroy, but to reclaim, to restore the balance of a life that had slipped away from me far too easily. And now, I was ready to take it back. The morning I met the attorney, the sky over Savannah looked washed clean, as if the world had been hung out in the sun to dry overnight. I felt strangely steady as I stepped into her office, a modern, quiet place with tall windows and polished floors that reflected thin lines of light. Vita Sterling greeted me with a nod, not warm, not cold, simply attentive. The kind of attentiveness that makes a person feel both seen and protected. She asked me to sit, folded her hands on the table, and waited. So I told her everything. Not in dramatic waves, but in simple, measured sentences. What had happened downstairs, what I had found in the tin box, the shift in my son's tone, the subtle but steady takeover of the home, how I felt something had been slipping from my hands long before I admitted it. She listened like a woman used to absorbing complicated stories without letting them overwhelm the room. When I finished, she didn't offer pity or outrage. Instead, she asked one single question. "Do you have any documents related to the property?" I opened my purse and slid out the papers they had shown me earlier, the ones they had used to justify future plans about the house. I hadn't studied them before. I had been too stunned, too heartbroken. Vita unfolded each page with the care of someone handling older academic files. At first, she read quietly, her expression neutral. Then her brow lowered just a fraction. She flipped to the next page, read it twice, then held it up against the light. "Mrs. Dubois," she said slowly, "these documents don't match the official records I've seen from similar property transfers." My heartbeat softened into a slow, steady rhythm. I already sensed this, but hearing it aloud from a professional coated the truth with a colder clarity. "What do you mean?" She tapped her finger on the corner of a page. "There are inconsistencies. Certain dates don't align with the timeline of your husband's earlier filings." She set another document beside it. "And here, there's some administrative confusion. This signature style doesn't match the one used on older archived papers from your family's file." I didn't need her to explain further. The moment she said inconsistencies, I felt a quiet resolve anchor itself deeper inside me. She leaned back slightly, studying the pages as though they held a story she had seen many times in different homes, different families. "Situations like this," she said gently, "carry reputational impact, especially for people whose social standing depends on clear, credible documentation. Names matter, heritage matters, accuracy matters." The way she said it, calm, steady, without embellishing anything, made the weight of her words settle into the room. I understood exactly what she meant, even without her naming a single consequence. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about pointing fingers. It was about the delicate architecture of someone's identity, the very identity my son had wrapped his life around. The name he believed made him significant. If the foundational documents didn't align with what he claimed, the people he admired and relied upon would quietly step back. Not angrily, not dramatically, simply out of caution, out of uncertainty, out of the instinct to distance themselves from confusion. Vida folded the papers neatly and placed them in a simple folder. "You don't need to do anything right now," she said. "Just let me review some older records connected to your family's property and heritage notes. Once I understand the full picture, we can talk about the best way to protect your peace." She didn't speak of plans or legal pathways or strategies, and I didn't ask. I didn't need anything drawn out or mapped. My mind had already begun shaping its own quiet path, one that required time, stability, and silence. Silence was something I had plenty of. I walked back into the house that afternoon feeling strangely invisible in the very home I had tended for decades. And yet, that invisibility had become my strength. They didn't notice me pause by the doorway. They didn't notice the folder tucked discreetly against my side. They didn't notice the small, steady shift in my posture. They were too busy discussing renovations again, too focused on imagining a home I barely recognized. I moved through the rooms with a calmness that surprised even me. Their words floated past me. Casual comments, light laughter, unaware that the ground beneath them was no longer stable. Not because of anything I was doing, but because the truth was finally beginning to breathe. And truth, once awake, rarely go back to sleep. In the days that followed, I didn't speak more than necessary. I cooked, I cleaned, I tended to Cornelius. And all the while, I kept listening, observing, allowing the tension in the house to rise in its own natural, inevitable way, like a pot on low heat, simmering toward the moment it would finally begin to boil. The day the envelope arrived, the sky outside was a muted gray, the kind that made the house feel even quieter than usual. I had just finished folding Cornelius's sweater when the doorbell rang. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud. It was the kind of ring meant for formal deliveries, brief, polite, unmistakably official. I opened the door to a courier holding a stack of neatly bound papers. He asked for my son by name, but when he saw I was the homeowner listed on the account, he handed the envelope to me with a nod and walked away. I didn't open it. I simply placed it on the hallway table and stepped back, knowing exactly what it contained. When Travante returned from a meeting and spotted the envelope, a small crease formed between his brows. Kessia drifted in behind him, carrying a bag of home decor samples, her smile fading the moment she saw his expression. "What's that?" she asked. "Probably something from the bank," he mumbled, tearing the flap in a hurry. The envelope opened. Nothing dramatic, almost anticlimactic, but the silence that followed had weight. He scanned the first page, his eyes narrowing. Then he looked again, slower this time, as if the words rearranged themselves into something deeply unsettling. "What is this?" he whispered. Kessia stepped closer, peering over his arm. Her hand flew to her mouth. This can't be real." I walked forward quietly, wiping my hands on my apron. "Everything all right?" I asked gently. They stared at me, expressions shifting between confusion and disbelief. The papers didn't contain accusations, no confrontational language, just a notice from my attorney stating that the property rights were under review, and until clarity was reached, the primary residents, meaning them, needed to temporarily relocate. The wording was polite, professional, almost soft, yet I could see the impact settle over them like frost creeping across glass. "Under review?" Kessia repeated, her voice trembling. "Why?" "Would anything be under review?" I simply tilted my head, as though equally unsure. "Sometimes older documents have inconsistencies," I said. "Sometimes the records don't match. Sometimes dates don't line up." The truth hung there in its quiet simplicity. They looked at each other, desperately searching for reassurance they couldn't find. For the first time, I saw a crack in their confidence. Not anger, not outrage, but the kind of uncertainty that makes the ground shift beneath a person's feet. "What inconsistencies?" my son asked. His voice didn't sound like the voice of a man in control. It sounded like the voice of a child who has misplaced something very important. I shrugged lightly. "Well, Vita mentioned that when reviewing our family's older heritage notes, some information didn't align perfectly. She said it might affect the way certain documents are viewed." I didn't say more. I didn't need to. The room thickened with silence. Kessia sank onto the edge of the couch, gripping her knees. "Heritage notes?" she whispered. "What heritage notes?" I watched the question land on my son, not fully understood yet, but felt in the way a tremor warns of something larger beneath the surface. His breath hitched, his jaw tightening. "Mom, what exactly is she reviewing?" I met his gaze with calm steadiness. "Your grandfather kept a great deal of documentation about our family's history. Some of it is older than we realized. Some of it contains information people might have overlooked." I paused, letting the softness of the statement settle. Sometimes when genealogical details are re-examined, people step back until things become clearer. The way his face paled told me everything. I hadn't mentioned anything specific. I hadn't pointed to any page in the tin box. I hadn't revealed a single personal truth outright. But his mind was already spiraling into the spaces between my words, the same spaces where doubt grows. He clutched the notice again, scanning it as if it— "So we have to leave," he murmured. "Just temporarily," I answered kindly, "until the records are sorted." Kessia stood up abruptly, pacing. "This doesn't make sense. Why would anyone question the records? Why now?" She looked at him, not me, and I saw something flicker in her eyes, the dawning fear that the foundation of their life might not be as solid as she believed. "Did your father ever tell you anything?" she asked him quietly. "Anything about the past? About where things came from?" His silence was answer enough, and in that silence, their relationship shifted. Trust faded just slightly, like light dimming behind clouds. Not broken, not yet, but no longer unshakable. He ran a hand through his hair, his voice brittle. "I don't know." I stepped back from the room, letting the air settle into its new shape. Their confidence, once hard and gleaming, had begun to crumble at the edges. Not because of accusations, not because of confrontation, but because truth, even hinted truth, has a way of unsettling those who build their lives on certainty. And as I walked down the hallway toward the study, I felt no triumph, no gloating, only a deep, steady knowledge that the shift had begun, quietly, gently, and inevitably. The gathering at their townhouse felt like stepping into a stage someone else had built. The living room was arranged so carefully it almost looked rehearsed. Chairs positioned in a semicircle, glasses of water lined neatly on the coffee table, and faces I hadn't seen in years waiting with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Relatives, business acquaintances, a couple of polished-looking partners, all of them invited to what my son clearly believed would be a moment where he regained control of the narrative. I stood beside Veta Sterling, who carried nothing but a slim folder and an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. My son came forward first, offering a sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mom," he said, voice soft, almost tender, "we're all here because we care. We just want to help you see that the choices you've been making lately, well, they don't make sense." He paused for effect, sweeping his gaze across the room as if trying to gather support. "You've been under a lot of stress. It's understandable. But I think you're not handling things well. Some decisions seem a little too emotional." The words were gentle, but I heard the intention behind them. Not cruelty, but control. He wanted the room to see him as the stable one, the reasonable one, the son stepping up to steady a mother he believed was drifting off track. I simply folded my hands and waited. Kessia leaned forward in her seat, clutching a tissue as if the weight of the world rested in her palms. "We're worried," she said softly, "about you, about the house, about Dad." I noticed how she emphasized the word worried, as though it created a moral shield around them both. My son continued, "We thought a group conversation might help, so we can all understand what's going on and why you would make such abrupt decisions." His eyes flicked toward the attorney, cold suspicion slipping into his tone, "especially now." I felt a ripple of unease move through the room. People shifted in their seats. No one wanted to be here, not really, but curiosity is a powerful force. Vita stepped forward then, completely unbothered by the attempt to reframe the conversation. Her voice was calm, almost meditative, as she placed her folder on the table. "Mr. Dubois," she began, "your concerns about your mother's decision-making are understandable to you, but we're here to address factual matters only, nothing more." She opened the folder and neatly arranged several papers in front of her. There was no dramatic pause, no sharp tone, just quiet precision. "I've reviewed documents connected to this property," she said, "and the primary issue at hand is that certain dates don't align with older official records." She tapped a page lightly. "Several administrative details conflict with previous filings your family made years ago. These inconsistencies raise questions that need to be clarified before any decisions can be finalized." She didn't accuse them. She didn't point fingers. She simply laid out facts. That was all it took. The room shifted. I felt it the way a person feels a sudden drop in barometric pressure before a storm. One of my husband's older cousins leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, frowning down at the papers as if the misaligned dates carried a gravity all their own. A business partner crossed his arms, his gaze sharpening into something cool and evaluative. Another relative whispered quietly to her husband. No anger, no judgment, but something was slipping, subtly, like sand draining from beneath a carefully built structure. Trust. My son saw it too. His shoulders tightened, and he let out a strained, almost laugh-like breath. So a few dates don't match? That could mean anything. Old forms get messy. People misfile things. "Yes," Vita agreed mildly, "which is why they require review, especially when heritage documentation is involved." That was all she said, heritage documentation. But the phrase alone caused a second wave of silence. The kind that makes a person confront the gaps in their own knowledge. The kind that hints at deeper roots, older histories, unspoken connections. I watched my son's face drain of confidence. Not completely, but enough for the room to notice. "Mom," he said suddenly, turning toward me with a softness that felt rehearsed, "whatever this is, we can fix it. You don't need to bring old papers into this. You don't need to let someone else make decisions for you." He reached for my hand, a gesture meant to look tender, supportive. "You're making this too complicated." His voice dropped. "Too emotional." For the first time since the confrontation began, I spoke. "I'm not making emotional decisions," I said quietly. "I'm making informed ones." The simplicity of the sentence seemed to echo. I saw several eyes turn toward me, not pitying, not doubting, simply reassessing. A soft but unmistakable realignment of understanding. Veda closed her folder with a gentle, final click. "Until the discrepancies are sorted," she said, "the house remains under Mrs. Dubois' authority. That's all anyone needs to know today. No drama, no threats. The truth didn't need volume, it simply needed presence." People began standing, murmuring polite goodbyes. Not avoiding my son, not yet, but stepping back just enough to show caution, just enough to show uncertainty. I watched as his shoulders sagged under the weight of a reality he hadn't expected. Not an attack, not a victory for me, just a quiet shift in the wind. Trust, the kind he relied on, was already beginning to fade, and he knew it, and I knew he knew it. It was the only moment in the entire gathering when I finally allowed myself to breathe. The months that followed unfolded with a quiet that no longer felt heavy, but necessary. Cornelius's health began to wane the way late summer leaves slowly lose their green, softening day by day until they finally let go. I spent those evenings sitting beside him, holding his hand as the humid Georgia dusk settled outside our windows. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried a gentleness that felt like a final stitching of all our shared years. We talked about our early days together, our first tiny apartment, the nights we spent dreaming of a family, the way we both fell in love with this house long before we could afford it. He smiled at memories I thought he had forgotten. One night, he whispered, "You've always kept our stories alive." I didn't realize then how close that was to goodbye. When he passed, it was quiet, almost peaceful, like a candle choosing its own moment to dim. I held his hand until it cooled, brushing my thumb over the knuckles I had memorized through 40 years of living. There was sadness, yes, but not the kind that crushes. It was a softer grief, the kind that honors a long, full chapter and turns the page gently. I buried him beside his adoptive father, Langston, two men whose hearts had shaped my home far more than any surname ever could. After the funeral, the house returned to me in a way it never had before, not as a burden, not as the center of conflict, as a companion, a place finally freed from tension and noise and hurried footsteps that never felt in rhythm with its old wooden floors. The rooms felt wider, the walls breathed easier, and I found myself stepping through each hallway with a quiet recognition, as if reclaiming pieces of myself I had tucked away too neatly over the years. The lower level, once the most painful room in the house, became the one I gravitated toward the most. I hired workers to open a small window near the ceiling so daylight could slip inside. I had the walls cleaned, brightened, and painted the soft cream color I used to love during my archival days. Wooden shelves were installed along the sides, each one smooth with fresh pine. In the center, I placed a large oak table where dust had once gathered undisturbed. I laid out the tin box there, not as a secret anymore, but as a beginning. Slowly, I filled the shelves with the pieces of a life I had spent years preserving for others. Letters, photographs, postcards, recipe cards in my grandmother's handwriting, the first birthday drawings Travante made as a boy. I cataloged them not to protect the past, but to honor it. The room became my archive, not a dark corner of the house, but the very heart of where I found myself again. With each item I placed carefully in a drawer or slipped into a protective sleeve, I felt another thread of my identity reattach. For years, I had defined myself as someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's caretaker. Now, I was returning to being simply Idella, the woman who once studied history. Because she believed every life, no matter how ordinary, held its own quiet story worth preserving. Autumn arrived and softened the garden with gold. The pecan tree outside the kitchen window dropped its leaves one by one until the ground looked like a carpet of amber. I found myself sitting on the porch most afternoons, sipping tea, letting the breeze rustle my hair the way it used to when I was a girl. One day, while sorting some old photos, I came across a picture of myself at 20, bright-eyed, glasses slipping down my nose, holding a stack of books with the delight of someone who believed her life would be written in her own words. I carried that picture to the new archive room and placed it beside Langston's letter. It felt right, the woman I used to be, resting beside the man who helped shape the life I lived. That afternoon, a soft gust carried through the open window and lifted a loose page from the table. I stepped out to the yard to catch it just as it fluttered near the birds. Pecan tree. The sky above had brightened into a brilliant blue, and in the distance, a child's kite danced in the wind, dipping and rising in playful arcs. I watched it for a long time, not because of the kite itself, but because of how freely it moved, unburdened by where it came from or who held the string, just present. Just soaring. I tucked the paper back into my palm and realized that, in my own quiet way, I felt the same. The house was mine again. My life was mine again. The past was no longer a weight, but a story. One I had chosen to preserve, one I had chosen to continue. And as I stood there in the crisp autumn light, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Pure, steady peace. If you've stayed with me all the way to this moment, then please like this video and leave a sweet little comment. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure you do it now. We share amazing stories like this every single day.